Today's daf we're going to be learning is Menachot Daf Ayin. Today's daf is dedicated to the complete recovery of those wounded in Dimona and Arad and all those injured in the war. May the merit of our learning bring them refuat nefesh and refuat guf b'toch sha'ar cholei Yisrael. Shavua Tov to everyone. Let's hope for a Shavua Tov and quiet. Okay, we're going to get started with our daf. We have a continuation of the questions that we had started asking yesterday. We're going to have a few more today. We're going to have 3 more and then end with one other kind of outgrowth of one of them. And with that, we'll get to the next Mishnah. So I would say the beginning of today's daf is a little bit more complicated. The second part is fairly straightforward once we get to the Mishnah. By Rabbah. So Rabbah asked the following question. Linya Masir Mai. Now, our previous question of Rabbi Shimon ben Pazi was, if I took a stalk of grain that was already grown to a third of its growth before the Omer, and then I replanted it. Now, when we're talking about replanting, what we mean is we take this standing stalk and we replant it as is, okay, in the ground. So it's already started growing, and now it grows more, and then we had some questions about that, right, about the difference between the ikar and then the growth. So now we're going to have another outgrowth, no pun intended, of that question. By Rabbah. So Rabbah, or maybe Rava, unclear, but one of them asked this question. Linya masir mai. What about for masir purposes? So what's the question exactly? Hechigami. What's the case? I'm starting, by the way, at the very bottom of Samach Tet and Bet. Kigon da amdinu v'aslinu v'shatlinu v'osifu lehu. We're talking about where we already took it out of the ground. Okay, we already, made an estimate of how much meiser we're supposed to have taken. We took maser. Why do you make an estimate? Because when it's in the standing stalks, you can't tell exactly how many grains of wheat there are. It's not like you can count, and then do an exact. So you do it by estimate. We took the maser. Vishatlinu. Now, after we already did maser, we replanted the stalk again, standing up. And now it grew more. If we say that the growth doesn't follow the main part, like in the previous sugya where they were suggesting that at least l'chumra you would say that, so then obviously the growth, tosefet ba'isure. In other words, if you say the original part, I shouldn't say the main part, the original part and the growth, right? What grew after I replanted. So if we say that the growth that was after I replanted doesn't follow the original. So for sure the growth is going to need meisering. That's for sure, because it wasn't meisered yet. But ikar mai, but what about, because that's a chumrah, right? We're going to say it doesn't follow the original lahachmir. So we're going to say obviously the growth needs maser. But what about the original part? I already meisered this part. So now whatever grows I have to meiser again, but not the part that wasn't. Or maybe I do because I replanted. So Amalei Abai. So Abai basically rejects the question. He says, what kind of a question is this? It's obvious. How do you grow grains? Okay, wheat, barley. You put the grain, right, one of the kernels, back in the ground. So it's always the case. So what happens? My kernels of wheat grow. Then I take maser from the whole pile, and then some of them, most of them I'm going to eat and turn into flour, and some of them I'm going to replant. Now, no one ever says, oh, well, maybe they're not chayav and maser because I replanted something that was already meisered. So obviously, the stalks, why would stalks be any different than the grain itself? So now Rabbah, or Rava, depending on who it was, is going to explain why it's very different. Amalei davar shezeh o kalel o mebayele. I wasn't talking about things like grains that you plant in the ground, that when you plant them in the ground, then that's it. You lose that grain. That grain now grows many other grains, but that grain itself isn't what I end up eating. So that grain basically disintegrates in the ground, right? And from there, it's going to come right, it creates roots and it grows. But that's not the case here. I was asking about a case. But in our case, right? I put the stalks in the ground. They're going to create new roots now, and they're going to grow more. But the actual chitin, the wheat that was growing already, is still in existence. It's not like it disappears, and becomes something else. It stays exactly as is. That's what I'm talking about. It's not the same as when you plant the kernels of grain in the ground. So he says, okay, still we could get to an answer. Tifsha lameha. We can learn it from here. I'm going to give you an example now of something that's ein zaro kale, that you're going to plant and it doesn't disintegrate. Okay, it becomes part of the vegetable. Amar Rabbi Yitzchak, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, litra batzal shetikno uzra'o. You have a measurement of the litra is a weight worth of, X amount of pounds of batzal, of onion, that you meisered, and then you replanted it. Okay, so onions you can plant. I was trying to look it up to see what would happen if you planted a whole onion. It seems like a whole onion will not get you another onion. But if you take the center of the onion, the bulb, right, which then the onion's going to grow around there and grow much bigger. So that's a case where ein zaro kale, you're going to plant this, and that's going to become part of the fruit itself, the vegetable. Mitasir lefi kulo, and when you take maser on the whole onion, not just not just the growth minus the bulb. So here you have an example where it's clear that this is all one vegetable. So therefore, by us, the grain should all be considered one, and the ikar should follow so we should have an answer from there. But they say no, because hatam hainu zriyato, ha-chalav hainu zriyato. With the onion, the reason why you take maser on the whole thing, even though you already meiser the bulb, we don't consider that at all, because that is the way you plant onions. It's not the only way you plant onions. I also looked that up. But it is the way that onions are commonly, or maybe were then commonly planted. But but it's not typical planting to take a stalk that grew a third, uproot it, and then later replant it. That's generally not the way you do these things. I've seen my mother does it. She takes basil and then she has it grow roots and she then plants them. Okay, like basil she buys in the store. Now that's not typical, okay? Most people don't grow basil in that way. At least I don't think so. But she does. But that's just not the typical way. And then maybe you would ask the question. But in a case where it's the typical manner, then of course you're going to meiser it. Because that's just the way, that's based on, okay, these are typical ways of planting things. We don't really consider that, this bulb is already there from before. Okay, in which case, we still don't have an answer to the question. Okay, we're kind of left without an answer, and we're going to move on to our next question. Amalei, so I just want to say what we did structurally. We brought a question. Abaye tried to reject the question, say, what's the place for this question? We said, no, there is, because he distinguished between the case he brought and the case the question was about. Then we said, well, maybe we have a potential answer for the question from the onion. And then we said, it's not like that either. So basically, by comparing different cases, we thought we could come to either there's no question at all, it's obvious what the answer is, or here's an answer to the question, but neither of them worked, because each time we said it's not the same thing. Now we have a question where, again, there's different variations of what exactly this question is, but we'll go with Rashi. If you have a plant without a hole, let's just give some background. We talked about these before, but you have a planter that has no hole in it. That means basically we're talking about a plant in a pot, which is not attached to the ground. If it has a hole in it, we mean it's a hole in it and it's on the ground, then some of the roots are going to come out and they're going to get into the ground. And then it's basically, it's going to end up being considered like something attached to the ground. Now, something attached to the ground is going to have all the doraita halachas of trumot, masrot, all that. If it's not attached to the ground, because it doesn't have any holes at the bottom of the pot, then it's all only by rabbinic law that it's obligated in trumot and masrot. So the Gemara asks, or Rabbi Chanina, Bar Minyume asked Abaye, what if you have a non-perforated plant, growth, mahu? So now they say, what's the question? Seems like he's saying if I have two like that are the same, without any perforated holes at the bottom, can I take trumot and masrot from one on the other? Which the Gemara says, right? Ilo nakuv, halo nakuv. Okay, if that's not nakuv and that's not nakuv, of course you can. They both have the same level. Right? It's always complicated when one is obligated by Torah law, one is obligated by rabbinic law. Okay, they're the exact same things. Of course you can take from one on the other, right? I have some, something growing in one, so I can basically take truma from one on the other. Okay, that's not the question. Dilma chazar v'nikvo ka'amart. What we mean is we have a non-perforated pot, and then we perforate it. So some of it grew, now you can see the similarity. Some of it grew before it was perforated and it wasn't attached to the ground. And some of it grew after it was perforated. And now we want to know, can we take truma from what grew in this pot on itself, right? Because some when it was attached to the ground, some when it wasn't attached to the ground. So they say, Ha chad izriyahu. But this is definitely one set of plants. This is not similar to the other case at all, because the other case had one thing that grew and it was already meisered. We cut it, it was meisered, and then it grew more later. Those are two different things. They were planted at two separate times. But ha chad izriyahu. This was all one plant that grew in one, right? We just made some holes at the bottom and continued like that. Right? It just connects into the ground and grows more. But hatam shtes rionin. But the previous question was two separate plantings, right? You planted it, cut it, took Truma Masrot, and then replanted it. That's different. That's two separate plantings. This was all one planting. So the fact that in the middle you perforated the pot doesn't really make any bit of a difference in terms of we still view this as all one growth. And obviously you can take Truma Masrot from one part of this plant on the other part of the plant. By Rabbi Avau, third question. You could really look at that as one question and then a question within that question, right? Because that second question about the perforated pot was kind of an outgrowth of the previous, of the stalk case. Now we have another case. Shibolet shemercha b'kli. We have stalks that we already did the pile and we did the flattening of the pile, which we know now means now it's obligated in tithing. But you didn't tithe it. And instead, what'd you do? Shtala. You planted it. You replanted it. V'kara aleh Hashem b'mechubar. Now, while it was replanted in the ground, you said this part of it is going to be truma. Okay, now, if something's obligated in truma and you say this is truma, then you've basically made it truma and it has the status of truma. If something is not obligated in truma and I said this is truma, I've done absolutely nothing. So when I then replanted, the stalk was obligated in truma, but then I replanted it. So the question is, Ma, kevan demercha, since I already put it in the pile and did the flattening of the pile, tavlahu, it's called tevel, v'kikara le'ashem, kachala. And when I called it truma, that actually has sanctity of truma, even though right now it's attached to the ground. Odil, and usually truma is not attached to the ground. Odilma, kevan deshatla, pakale tivlamina. Or since I planted it, maybe we say, now it's no longer tevel, right? The tevel gets removed, just like we've talked before. I took grains of wheat and I planted them in the ground. They're no longer, right? Whether they were meiser, they're no longer considered meiser. If they were tevel, they're no longer tevel. I replanted them. They become something new. Now here it's a little different because it's a stalk again, right? With stuff growing on it. So question is it still tevel? And if I call it truma, will this be truma or not? Amrele Rabbanan l'Abai. So the rabbis say to Abai. Okay, so Rabbi Avau asked the question. The rabbis say to Abai, in Ken, this is a crazy question. It doesn't make any sense. If the answer would be yes, it's truma, well then matzina truma b'mechuber l'karka. Then we have a case where there's truma in something attached to the ground. Utnan, now it's not tnan. Tnan means we learned a Mishnah. There's definitely no Mishnah like this. And even if you say it's a Braita Tanya, the commentaries point out no one's ever seen this Braita before. Okay, it doesn't appear anywhere in Shas and it doesn't appear in the Midrash Halacha. Okay, it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. So because sometimes Braita, one person brought it and that was it. It's quoted once, but just so you know, there's a whole discussion about this. But he says, but there's a Braita that says, and maybe it's so obvious to him, like I've heard this so many times, it's clear, like he thinks it's a Braita, I don't know. But either which way he says, Lo matzinu truma b'mechuber lakarka. There is no such thing as truma b'mechuber lakarka. Okay, we don't find truma in mechuber lakarka and things attached to the ground. So you can't possibly say that we're going to call this truma in the ground and it's going to be effective when there is no such thing as truma attached to the ground. So Amar Le, Abai says to the rabbis, no, that's not going to be a difficulty on this question because kitan yahi le'ian ichiyuve mita v'chomesh ditalish ba'achil talushu. Okay, that was a mouthful. Let's explain. When it's said in that Braita that there's no such thing as truma mechuber lakarka, what they mean is, if you are a non-Kohen and you eat truma that's attached to the ground, you will not get punished. Okay, what are your punishments that you could possibly get? If you did it intentionally, it would be mita, it would be death by the hands of God. If you did it unintentionally, it would be you'd have to pay the value of what you ate plus a chomesh. So when they say mita v'chomesh, they mean death if you did it intentionally, payment plus the extra fifth, which is really a quarter, but without getting into that right now, but plus paying the extra quarter of it if you did it unintentionally. So, and now, let's keep going in the Gemara again, the part that I read. What does that mean? What does it mean you're not going to be chayav for eating it? Okay, it doesn't mean, what they're basically saying, it doesn't mean it's not truma. It just means that you won't be obligated if the truma is still attached to the ground when you eat it. Meaning, di talish va'achil talishu. If you picked up something, if you detached it from the ground and you ate it, you'd be chayav. Because what it means is, ein truma b'mechuber lakarka. It means, igachin va'achil, if you bend down into the ground. It was truma growing, okay, let's say, for example, maybe our case, okay, but somehow if you had truma growing, it doesn't necessarily answer our question. It's just saying there is a place for our question. Because if you were to bend down, and let's say there's carrots growing on the floor, and you just, start biting on the carrot while it's in the ground, well, again, going back to typical and atypical ways of doing things, that's not called achila. That's the way dogs eat, right? Or something like that, or animals eat. That's not called eating. So you won't, when you have an isur achila, where you get a punishment for eating, it has to be in a normal, typical way that everyone eats. So maybe you're a little abnormal in this way. But batzla dato etzel kol adam, that's a famous concept. We judge eating by what the typical eating is. So we're going to basically say right now that don't worry about that braita, that there's no such thing as truma b'mechuber lakarka, and therefore you thought to try to say, what kind of question is this? No. You could still have truma b'mechuber lakarka. What it means is if you were to bend down and eat it, on the ground while it was still attached, you wouldn't be obligated isur achila. You're forbidden for, you wouldn't get the punishments for. Doesn't mean it can't be called truma while it's attached to the ground. So now they say, now they're not going to get back to the question actually. Now they're going to raise a difficulty on the way we just explained this braita. We just explained this braita and said we're going to distinguish between if you detach something from the ground and eat it, that will be called eating. If you eat it in an atypical manner, you're not going to get punished for eating in an atypical manner because that's not called achila, like by bending down and eating it while it's attached to the ground. So the assumption is, and this is where we're going to get to the next question, if something's attached to the ground or maybe attached to something and you're eating it in an atypical manner, okay? You're eating something in an atypical manner that, let's forget the attached to the ground right now. If you eat something in an atypical manner, it's not called achila, for the sake of punishment, or maybe for the sake of something else which requires achila. So what is that? So now they're going to ask a question. How is this different from what's written in the book, right? He had like a notebook of ilfa. Remember ilfa with Rabbi Yochanan? They had this whole deliberation. Should they go get jobs and stop learning in yeshiva? And Rabbi Yochanan ends up staying in yeshiva. And ilfa goes to yeshiva. There's a famous story, if you remember. If not, I'm sorry, Ilfa goes to work, goes to Chutz La'aretz to work. Anyway, Ilfa still remains a bit Talmid Chacham, even though he does leave the yeshiva to go work. But in Ilfa's Pinkas, he wrote the following halacha. Okay, it's interesting. We have a person, it's rare, I don't remember seeing this much in Shas, where somebody's writing down halachot, and it said in his book, Beitzei nivlata of hatahor. Okay, now we have to go back and remember what nivelat of tahor is. If you have a kosher bird that dies without being slaughtered properly, it has tuma, but what kind of impurity? Impurity that when you're eating it, and this is why it's going to be important, when it's in your mouth, okay, you are metame beit habliya, your clothes become tameh and all that, but you carry impurity while it's in your mouth. So now, it's not by touching it, okay, it's by while you're eating it. Now, if you have a bird that died, and it had eggs inside it when it died, Miksatam b'chutz, miksatam b'fnim. Some are still inside and some are already outside. So, mi b'fnim, mitamim b'gadim b'beit habliya. If you eat the ones from the inside, and the assumption is, how do you eat the ones on the inside? Well, you basically put your mouth by the innards of that bird and you kind of chewed out the eggs. So while it sounds a little disgusting, I know, while you're eating those eggs. Now, is that a typical manner of eating eggs? No. Usually you eat eggs that are outside the body of the bird. But in this case, you ate them while they were inside the body of the bird, and they carry impurity. Now, why do they carry impurity? Because we're saying they're part of the bird itself, right? Even though eggs are kind of independent, but it's considered, while the bird died, they were inside, they're considered like the bird itself, and the bird was, died by natural causes, not by slaughtering, so the eggs are forbidden, meaning they carry impurity. So if you're to eat them, they're going to carry impurity, even if you eat them in an atypical manner. Okay, and that's the difficulty, because eating them, okay, so let's just keep reading. Mibachutz, if you eat those eggs that are outside the body, right? If you eat them from the outside, from outside, that's not going to carry impurity because they're outside the body now. So anyway, what do they say here? It seems like you're eating in an atypical manner, and it's going to have the laws of eating. Like, who eats eggs by sticking their mouth into the bird and getting into the innards and pulling out those eggs? That's not the typical manner of eating the eggs. So they say, and therefore, we said before, by eating the vegetables that are in the ground that are truma, you're not going to be chayiv in truma because it's an atypical manner. And here it is considered eating. So they say no. Talush. We're going to distinguish between the two cases. The bird is detached from the ground. Okay, bird's roe is detached from the ground. But the point is, it's not the same as the truma. People don't eat things attached to the ground, but they might stick their mouth in. Okay, it still seems kind of atypical, but once something's detached from the ground, you could have someone who sticks their mouth near there and tries to chew out the eggs. That you could see somebody doing that in a more normal way because it's already detached from the ground. But literally bending down on the ground and eating things attached to the ground, that really nobody does. So we will distinguish between that, and therefore this isn't a question at all on the answer that Abaye gave about the truma being attached to the ground, the way he described that braita. Again, this doesn't really end up answering our question at all. So in this case, we had a question. We had a difficulty on the question for this braita. To resolve the difficulty on the question, we resolved the Braita and said the Braita is really only talking about you could have truma attached to the ground. You're just not going to be chayav achila on it because that's not a typical way of eating. And then we questioned that assumption, that answer, based on the nevelat of tahor issue and the eggs, but resolve that because they're really not the same. Again, what we've really been doing today is just comparing cases to try to get to answers for things or try to get to say, why are you even asking that question? But in the end, right, all the comparisons kind of fall short because they're not exactly the case we're talking about. And then we're left with no real answers. Okay, and that ends our questions. And now we have one last part before we get to the next Mishnah. Amarav Tavyumi, Bar Kisna, Amar Shmuel, because we talked about the perforated pots and the non-perforated pots. Amar Shmuel, Hazorea Kilayim Ba'atzit She'eino Nakuv Asul. If you plant mixed breeds in a non-perforated pot, it's forbidden. Okay, so Amar Abaye says, okay, isn't this obvious it's forbidden? Okay, and therefore he's going to say, Bishlama yeshmi'ina lo kemakat mardumi derabanan shapir. If what Shmuel is trying to tell us is, he never said this, but if he's trying to tell us that if you were to plant, okay, so what do you have? You have grains, and within that you plant a vine in a perforated pot. So if you want to say that you're going to get lashes for doing that by rabbinic law. Makat mardud is the lashes, right? Malkot is the lashes you get by Torah law. And the rabbis instituted what they call makat mardud, which basically means lashes for rebelling, because you're going against what the rabbis instituted. So that's viewed as a rebellion. So if you want to tell me you get lashes for this, then I understand why you're telling us this. Because not everything that's forbidden by rabbinic law gets lashes. In fact, there's certain rules. It's mainly if something has ikar in the Torah, like the main thing is Torah, and the rabbis kind of interpreted like there's a basis for it in the Torah. And like, there's many things that are rabbinic that have no basis in the Torah at all. And then there's other things that have a basis in the Torah. And then what would he be telling us is we view this case, kilayim, of a non-perforated pot as something that has a basis in the Torah. You could see there could be a whole discussion. What has basis in the Torah? What doesn't have basis in the Torah? What's going to come under this rule where we're going to get lashes for it by rabbinic law? So if that's what he's telling us, Shapir, then I understand. He's telling us something that maybe isn't so obvious. But Ela Asul, if you want to say that he's telling us it's forbidden to do this, don't put your vine and your grains together in a perforated pot, right, within a certain distance, right? It would have to be a small enough perforated pot to be chayiv. My kamashmalan. What's he trying to tell us? To me, Rabbanan Havi Yizriya, that we're going to view something in a perforated pot as being planted, and once it's planted, it comes into the laws of kilayim. We know that, Tanina. We know that from many other sources, okay? It says in a Tannaitic source, Taram misheino nakuv ala nakuv, truma v'yachzor v'yitram. You can't take truma from a non-perforated pot on a perforated pot. Why? If you have lemons growing in a perforated pot and you have lemons growing in a non-perforated pot, you can't take the non-perforated one and say, I'm going to take my lemon from here and resolve the truma issue, right? And tithe the produce that's in the perforated pot that's attached to the ground. Why? Because that's chayav on a Torah level, and this is chayav on a rabbinic level. However, if you did it, since you are liable on a rabbinic level, this actually is obligated in truma, your non-perforated pot. Well, then your truma, it is considered truma, meaning if I took my lemon from the pot that wasn't attached to the ground, and I took it to resolve to tithe the produce that was in the pot that was attached to the ground because it was perforated. So I haven't resolved the other stuff is untithed because by Torah law, that needs tithing. The stuff that's attached to the ground needs tithing by Torah law. And I've taken it from something that's actually not obligated by Torah law. But it is called truma. The lemon that I took from the non-perforated pot has the status of truma. That's what it means, truma v'yachzor v'yitron. It is truma. It does have truma. So if, let's say, someone eats it, they won't get punished by Torah law, but it is technically truma. So what does that mean? If it's technically truma, then it means that it is obligated by rabbinic law. So by rabbinic law, it has the status of truma. However, it doesn't resolve the tithing that the other stuff is still what we call tevel, untithed produce. And I have to tithe it from something that's actually obligated because we say, right now, this is chayav, but only by rabbinic law. So the other one's chayav by Torah law. So I can't, so on a Torah level, it's patur and chayav, right? It doesn't work. One's exempt, one's not exempt. But on a rabbinic level, it will be considered, and therefore he's saying it can't be. That's what he's telling us, because that's obvious from other Tanaitic sources. So it must be he's coming to tell us about the Makar Mardut. Okay, and that was just a halacha that came up because we were talking about Atzit Seinu Nakuv and the level of obligation of that kind of growth. Okay, now we're going to move on to the next Mishnah. And this is going to connect to Pesach, so it's very nice. Achitin, v'asaurim, v'akusmim, v'ashibolet, shual, v'ashipon. Okay, these are the 5 grains. Wheat, barley, spelt, oat, and, am I blanking? Shifon, rye. Okay, 5 grains. Why are we talking about the 5 grains? Hare elu chayavim b'chala, umitztarfim zehem zeh. So the first halacha is, these are all chayav in chala. Okay, if you make dough with them, you're chayav. And they're mitzdarfim zehem zeh. If you make a dough with a bunch of different flours mixed together and you get to the requisite amount that you have to take challah, we're going to count them all together. And asurim b'chadash milifnei Pesach. And they're also the 5 grains that are forbidden to eat from the new grains. Okay, now new grains, you might have thought maybe it's just barley, where we bring the korban ha'omer from, and chitim, which we bring the shtei alechem from. Because remember, that permits, right, all the new grains for people to eat, but it's not just the 2 of them; it's all the 5 grains. Okay, so even though on the altar you're only going to end up bringing the barley and the wheat, but it actually everything is forbidden. Any of these 5 grains are forbidden until you bring the korban ha'omer. Umiliktzor milifnei ha'omer. And you also, okay, so they're asurim b'chadash. Now, actually, there's a girsa problem here. We're going to read it a little differently than what it says. They're asurim b'chadash milifnei ha'omer, because you can't eat them until the omer is brought. And they're forbidden to harvest all those 5 grains milifnei ha'pesach, from before Pesach. What they mean before Pesach, they mean before the first day of Pesach is over. Okay, once the first day of Pesach is over, you can already start harvesting them, not really that night, but the next morning, right? Why can't you do it at night? Because that's when they harvest the barley for the omer. You can only start harvesting after the barley is harvested for the omer. So the chiddush of this Mishnah is that it applies to all 5 grains, not just to barley, and not just maybe you would have thought to wheat. Now, what are you allowed to eat chadash? What does it permit? It permits anything. Now, from now until next korban ha'omer is brought, anything that took root before the omer, okay, then the omer permits it. So even though now it's not grown yet, but if it already took root before the omer is brought, or before, we're going to see before what, we don't know exactly what yet. Is it the day? Is it the omer? We'll get back to that. So we'll finish today's stuff. But if they took root before, then it will be permitted, and you won't have to wait till the next omer to permit it. But if not, they're going to be forbidden until the next omer. And yes, we did see this Oh, okay, you're talking about the Ilfa story. But this source was actually quoted, I think, 2 dapim ago. Yeah, on Daf Samach Tet, actually yesterday's Daf. Okay, now we're going to get to the Gemara. Tana kusmin min chitim, shibola shu'al v'shipon min se'olim. Okay, so now there's a braita that disagrees with our Mishnah that says that we're going to classify these 5 grains as some go under the category of wheat. Wheat is going to include spelt. And barley, like oats and rye, are going to be included in the barley category. Okay, why is this relevant? So Rashi tells us this is for challah, because in Masechah Challah it says, "Hachitin ein mitztarfim mimakol chutz min hakosmin, hasorim mitztarfim mimakol chutz min hachitim." Okay, and our Tana disagrees and says they're all mitztarfim zeim zeh. Okay, so there it seems to be categorizations of it has to be the barley ones mixed with the barley and count together for Yichud of Challah, and the wheat ones mixed with the wheat ones. So that's why it's important to categorize. But there seems to be this debate about it because our Mishnah doesn't say that. Okay, kusmin. Now they're going to translate. What are kusmin? Okay, these words don't help us because they're Aramaic words that we don't know. But we already know. I already told you what the English is, and anyone who lives in Israel and buys these kind of flours knows what they are. Or buys bread like that. Kusmin gulba, shifon dishra, shibola chual, shibola ta'ala. Okay, fine. Now they tell us, hani in orez v'dochan lov. Okay, apropos Pesach. Say the 5 grains, these are the 5 grains. Orez and dochan, okay, rice and millet. Now they are technically called a grain, but they are not part of these 5 grains. Where do we get this from? Well, and meaning they're not chayv and challah. If you make some sort of dough with rice or millet, you're not chayv and challah. And now we're going to see we learned this all from Pesach because Amar Rish Lakish atya lechem lechem matzah. Okay, lechem comes from matzah. Meaning, what is lechem? Lechem, it's a gzera shava. It talks about lechem and challah. Okay, when you have your bread, and it talks about lechem in matzah. Where does it talk about lechem? It calls it lechem oni. Okay, now they're going to read the psuki. K'tiv hacha. Here it says. In challah, when you eat from the bread of the ground, uchtiv hatam lechem oni, poor man's bread. That's what we call matzah. So now they're going to say because matzah is only made from the 5 grains and not from rice and millet, which we're going to see in a minute where we get that from. But then we learn gzera shava to challah. Challah is the same 5 grains. Okay, hatam gufa minela. Where do we learn that matzah is only from the 5 grains? In a second, we're going to get to chametz and why rice is not chametz. Okay, even though many people don't eat kitniot, but it's not because it's chametz. So there's the Tana in the house of Rabbi Yishmael and in the house of Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. And Rish Lakish said this. So they, in the same pasuk, they juxtapose, don't eat chametz. For 7 days, eat matzah, poor man's bread. So then what do they say? Shiv'at yamim tochal alav matzot lechem oni. So for 7 days, you eat matzah, which is the bread of affliction. Right, maybe it's a better way to say it rather than a poor man's bread. Tvarim haba'im lidei chimutz adam yotzei behem yedei chavato b'Pesach. From here we learned only items that can rise. Okay, can become tichimutz, become chametz. You can eat them on Pesach. Yatsu elu she'em ba'em lidei chimutz ela lidei surchon. If you try to ferment them and have them rise, they won't. They'll get rotten. They'll turn sour. Okay, so basically, you're not going to end up with anything. You can't make matzah has to be right. It's this fascinating thing, which matzah has to be something that potentially could have become chametz. Right? You specifically make matzah out of, right? That's why flour, for example, right, is not chametz. When you're getting rid of your chametz in your house, you have raw flour, right? It should be closed and put away so it doesn't become, right? But it's not actually chametz because that's what you make matzah out of. You just have to be careful that it doesn't go farther than 18 minutes. Okay, we've been talking about all the problems. I don't know, I haven't seen anything in the news about all these sirens that go off all in the middle of people making matzahs. I don't know what because every time we, make sure everything's off in the kitchen before you go downstairs. And I had a problem once or twice with this burnt food. So anyway, it has to be something that could potentially come to the chimutz. Now, rice and millet cannot, and that's why rice and millet are out. Now, it happens in Pesachim. There's a machloket about this. Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri in the Tanaitic time, he actually thought that rice could be chametz. And when the whole kitniot thing came about, which nobody really knows when and where it started, or when. We only hear about it later, once it becomes a custom already in the late 1200s. And it's a fascinating topic. And then the Sephardim come and say, it's a minhag ta'ut. It's just a total mistake, because what they thought we hold like Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, and nobody does. But it seems like it developed for other reasons, right? Like concern, perhaps. Again, everything is just commentary after. Like they saw people were doing this. It became very popular that nobody was eating kitniot. And then the rabbis try to figure out why. Either because you can make something that's bread-like from it, even though it's not really bread, it doesn't really rise, or the grains got mixed up in the, when you go to the shuk, let's say, and you find, you see they're all next to each other, and it could be grains that were forbidden got mixed up with them. Nobody knows exactly why it started, but it not for this reason, not because anyone really thinks it's chametz. Okay, so now we basically, so if we go backwards in the sugya, we learn that the 5 grains are what you make matzah out of. Since matzah is called lechem oni, we're going to learn from there. And why? Because the chametz juxtaposition, only things that can become chametz can be used for matzah. From there we get to that's lechem oni, and challah says lechem. So lechem. We're going to learn challah also is the 5 grains. Okay, now we're going to see another one of these coming up soon, but now we're moving on to the next section of the Mishnah, mitztarfim zeim zeh. So now if we're talking about tzeruf, we're going to bring another source about them joining. Now there we said they combine together for the chiyuv of challah. So if you have a bunch of mixed flours that you make a dough out of, a bread out of, which often people do, so you're going to be chayav in challah when you get to the requisite amount of all of them together. Now we have another braita, which doesn't say what the topic is. It says hatfuah v'akmachim v'abetzekot. So both the grains themselves, the flour made from the grains, and doughs, mitztarfim zeim zeh, combine with each other. So they mean the grains and the flours and the doughs of these of the 5 different grains. So what are the ramifications of this statement? So now we're going to have 4 answers to this question. It's not like they don't agree with each other. They're each just saying there's another ramification for this. Amarav kahana le'inyan chadash, for chadash purposes. Now, what does it mean for chadash purposes? Now, here we're not talking about is a chayav and challah, let's say. But what we want to know is if you eat chadash, you transgressed, right? You eat the new crop before it's allowed. You've done a transgression. Now, when we talk about eating, we talk about, you're not going to be chayav if you eat a little morsel. If you eat a kazayit, well, what does the kazayit have to be made up of? Does it have to be just a kazayit of wheat, just a kazayit of barley that was a new crop? No, it could be any combination. As long as you ate a kazayit of a combination of either grains or flours or dough of all these 5 grains mixed together, they will combine to have you obligated by eating a kazayit. Okay, likewise for the next one. Rav Yosef Amar Linyan Chametz B'Pesach, same thing. If you ate chametz on Pesach, and what you happened to eat was a mix of, you ate a kazayit's worth of a mix of the 5 grains, or 2 of the 5 grains, doesn't have to be all of them, right? And you could do just one by itself, obviously you'd be chayiv, but even if it was a mixture, a combination, you'd be chayiv. Rav Papa Amar Linya Maser Sheni. Remember, Maser Sheni has to be eaten in Jerusalem, your second tithe. If you ate it outside the walls of Jerusalem, you would get lashes. Now here we're going to say, if it was Maser Sheni, a combo, you ate a kazayit of a combo of wheat and barley, let's say, you get lashes. Fourth one. The fourth one is a little different than all the others. Le'inyan tumat ochlin. Is something going to become tameh? Okay, this could either be a kazayit or a kabetza, depending on the opinion who you hold by. But anyway, a kabetza is definitely the shear to be mitame something else. Like if you have food that's tameh and it touches something else, it can make it tameh, but only if it's a kabetza. The question is, to become tameh, is it a kazayit or a kabetza? That there's a machloket. But anyway, whatever the shear is, they can be mitzdarif. And what they're going to say now is hakamashman. So again, you have tumat ochlin, which is again a mix of these things. It can get to the requisite amount, whether it's a kazayit or a kabetza, to become tameh. If it's a combination, again, you can count these grains mixed together. So now they say, what he wants to teach us is, now they say the fact that these can be any food, in Me'ilah it talks about any food is mitzaref zem zeh for tumat ochlin. So he can't be telling us you can mix an apple and a grain of wheat. Like anything mixes together for tumat ochlin. But what they want to know here is that he said must be telling us something in addition. Now notice it said tfuah kmachim and betzekot. Now what they're going to say is tfuah kmachim dumia de betzekot. They must be like batzek. In what way? Mahatam uchle be'ene. Now, a dough, you eat the entire part of the dough. But a kernel of grain, you don't eat the entire thing. Now it depends. They're going to say in barley, nobody would eat the peel. Okay? And in the flour, you might also still have, right, until you've sifted it well, you might still have all the stuff that you're going to throw out, right, all the chaff. So, just like the batzech is uchla be'ene, we only take into consideration what you're going to eat because the whole thing is something you're going to eat. Af hachanami uchla be'ene. Also here, when we're talking about the kemach, and we say we can mix these things, well, we're only going to consider the barley, the edible parts of the barley. Okay, and we're not going to take into consideration when we're measuring this requisite amount when it comes to the barley, the psolet, the bad parts that no one's going to eat. V'hatanya, and here's a braita to support this reading. Chita, and others again, this was the reading of what they assumed Rava meant. Chita ben klufa ben she'ena klufa mitzdarefet. So a kernel of wheat, whether it's peeled or not peeled, combines because people eat the peel of the wheat. But se'ora klufa mitzdarefet she'ena klufa mitzdarefet. But the barley, nobody will eat the peel; it's inedible. To which the Gemara says, "Ini, are you sure? Is that really true?" Tanad be Rabbi Yishmael, and a braita says, "Al kol zera zeru asher yizarea," which is talking. That's the pasuk about what could be susceptible to impurity, which is what we're talking about. Kederach. Now, notice it says any seed. So they say kederach shebenei adam motziim lizriah. The way your seeds could become impure, the way people plant them. Now, what's your seed like when you plant it? Okay, the wheat, the barley, that's the key problem. The barley with its peel and the lentil with its peel. So they say lo kasha, don't worry about that. There's different cases with the barley and the wheat and the barley, where the barley will be considered for being susceptible to impurity, the husk of the barley, and cases where it won't be. Lo kasha, habalachot, habiyabeshat. If they're moist, then, at least according to the mainstream, okay, Rambam has a completely opposite answer than I'm going to explain right now. When they're moist, they're more edible, or also, it's not necessarily just that they're edible. Rashi points out they also protect the kernel. So they're considered part of the food because they're protecting the kernel. Whereas if they're hard, they can crack very easily and they're not really protective at all. Plus they're inedible. So then we're going to call them inedible. So that distinguishes and that resolves that problem, that small problem with the barley, with the source that seems to say barley is susceptible to impurity, the husk of it. So it depends on the scenario. Okay, Asurim b'chadash milifnei. Here we have the problem with the girsa. I'm going to read it lifnei ha'omer. Okay, you can't eat chadash before the omer. Menani mile. Where do we get it from? In other words, that again, all 5 grains. Now we get to another gzeira shava. Amarish lakish atya lechem lechem imatzah. Again, we're going to learn from matzah. It says lechem. Also by chadash it says lechem. So you can't eat. Right? It says lechem kaliva karmel lo tuchlu ad etzem hayom hazeh. Okay, there it says bread. Bread means all 5 grains. Now we get to our final section. V'liktzor lefnei Pesach. Oh no, there's one more thing before we get there. Liktzor lefnei Pesach. Right, you can't harvest any of these before Pesach. Although remember we learned there are ways if you do it by hand, if you do it in a beit shlachim. But okay. Menane milei am Rabbi Yochanan atya reshit michala. Okay, now we make a gzeira shava. Reshit kitzirchem. The omer is the first thing you harvest. Now again, you might say maybe it's just barley, but the reshit arisotechem, the same word reshit appears by chala. So because challah we already learned is all 5, also the Reishi Kitzurchem is all 5. Okay, now our last sugya. So now they say, my kodem la'omer. When they say, going back to asurim b'chadash milifnei omer, you can't eat chadash until the omer. What do we mean until the omer? Now we're getting into machloket, which sounds exactly like the machloket we saw previously, about is it the morning or is it the bringing of the omer that permits it? And we're going to see it in the name of Rabbi Yonah and Rabbi Yossi bar Safta. Rabbi Yonah omer, kodem tzirata omer, before the omer is harvested, which basically means, right, you can't eat it till you harvest the omer. You do that at night, which basically gets you to the morning. Okay, we're going to call this Yom Mizrach, even though it's not exactly, because the omer is harvested at night, but really, who's really eating late at night anyway? So what they mean is, right, in the morning. Rabbi Yossi bar Savda amar kodem haba'at omer, before you bring the omer, which is sometime in the morning of Tetzayim, but the omer has to be brought, which sounds exactly like the machlokah we saw before. So now they say, wait a minute. One of these opinions really makes no sense in light of the Mishnah. Now, the Mishnah distinguished between, it said, you can't eat the chadash until the omer, and you can't harvest it until the Pesach, which we understood to mean until the end of Tetzayin Nisan, which basically takes you to, right, Yud Zayin Nisan in the morning, likely. So now, if we say it like that, Bish Tnan Asurim B'Chadash Lefnei HaOmer Uliktzor Lefnei HaPesach. So now they say, Bishlam Alamanda Amar Kodem Hava'ata Omer. Okay, Rabbi Yossi Bar Zavda makes perfect sense, because we're going to say, Hainu Delo Ariv Lehu V'Tane Lehu. Why are these listed as two separate things? According to Rabbi Yossi Bar Zavda, because they're two separate times. You can't harvest until the morning, right, till Pesach, the end of the first day of Pesach, and basically meaning, well, the next morning, because who's harvesting at night. And you can't eat until the Omer is brought. Those are two different times. There's a difference of a few hours between them. So it makes sense that they're listed as two separate things. But Lamand Amar Kodem Ksirat HaOmer, that you can't, right, if you say you can't eat until the Omer's harvested, basically until the morning, then la'arvinu v'litminu. Asurim, you should have just put them together. They're all the same time. Asurim b'chadash uliktzor lifnei Pesach. Should have just said until the end of Tetzayin Nisan, right? And I'm sorry, I'm saying the wrong date. I mean till Tetzayin Nisan. Sorry that I kept saying at the end of till Tetzayin Nisan. Okay, till the day after the first day of Pesach. And then it's all permitted, basically, from the morning. Go harvest, go eat, do whatever you want. So it shouldn't have listed them as two separate things, to which we say we obviously misunderstood this machloket. Ela itmar seifa itmar. If we have this machloket between them, it must be they're actually not talking about what we thought they were talking about. We thought they were talking about when can you eat the Omer, and it's like that machloket we discussed previously about, is it Hiyur Mizrach, is it when the sun rises, is it when you bring the Omer? That's not what their machloket was about at all. And then we're going to finish with this. It was talking about imishrishu kodem la Omer haOmer mitiran. Now it said, if they took root, where's the border? Where do you put the line for what's chadash and now permitted, and what's going to be chadash of next year, right? That will be forbidden all year long. If it took root before the Omer, it's already permitted this year. So whenever it grows later in the year, you can eat it. If it took root after the Omer, then it's not permitted. Now, when do we count the Omer from? What does the Omer mean? Does it mean starting from Tet Zayin Nisan, or does it mean starting from, right? It could have even taken root from the morning of Tet Zayin Nisan until the Omer was brought. Would that then say it's permitted? Okay, that would be a more lenient opinion. And for that, they have a machloket. So, my kodem laomer. What does it mean? Hishrishu kodem laomer. What they're pointing out is also the words kodem laomer appear twice in our Mishnah. So there was a debate about which words kodem laomer were they debating about. So now they say it must be the sefer. So Rabbi Yonah Amar kodem hava'ata omer. Rabbi Yossi Bar Zavda Amar kodem ksirata omer. And then they said that's the machloket. So does it have to take root before the omer is harvested at night? And then anything harvested in the morning before the Omer is brought, you can't eat this whole year. You have to wait till next year. Or if it took root already that morning before the Omer was brought, then already you can permit it this year. That's the machlokah between them, and not what we thought it was, because otherwise that made no sense for our Mishnah to separate those two things. Okay, with that, we finished for today. So what we did in the first part was we had more questions about combination of things that grew from, right, original growth and extended growth from later, and Truma and Masra related issues. Then we got to the Nakuv and Eino Nakuv. And it started, it wasn't perforated. Then you perforated it, and it has a growth of a combo of the things. We got to the, you called it Truma after you replanted it, right? You replanted, then called it Truma. Is there such a thing as Truma Mechubar L'Karka? In the end, we said there is, but it doesn't necessarily mean that this is really going to be valid as Truma or not. In the end, we really didn't have an answer. And then we had that other outgrowth of it, talking about the Zorei Kilayim and the Natzisheno Nakuv, and that he must have been talking about Makat Mardut, otherwise it didn't make any sense. Everyone knows that would be Kilayim, because obviously it's considered planting in a non-perforated planter. Okay, then we got to the whole question of these 5 grains and all sorts of ramifications of where the 5 grains are all considered either combined with each other or also just obligate, right? You're obligating challah, you can use them to make matzah, and you're obligating chadash. You can't eat them until the Omer is brought. And then from there, we got in this whole discussion about the end part of the Mishnah about Asurim b'chadash l'fnei Omer and l'ktsor l'fnei Pesach. And then we thought we had this machloket about the other thing. And then we said in the end, that's not the machloket. It's really about the hishrishu. Okay. And with that, we finish for today. Wishing everyone a Shavua Tov. Maybe a week of calm and peace, although it's definitely not looking that way yet. Wishing everyone a good day.